Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Vic Alhadeff, the CEO of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. Vic, thank you very much for joining us today. I know you have a very personal connection with Auschwitz. Can you tell me a bit about your family story?
Sure. My family came from Rhodes Island, one of the largest of the Greek islands of Rhodes. And they'd been there for several hundred years. And in 1938, so right before World War II began, a series of decrees were passed against the Jews of that part of the world, essentially excluding them from civil society. Couldn't marry other people, couldn't work in the public sector, couldn't go to public schools. So many of the 3,000 of the 5,000 Jews on Rhodes left, including my father, who left for Zimbabwe. The issue was he was engaged to be married to a young lady named Becky Hassan. And his aim was to bring out Becky, his parents, and his teenage sisters. German forces arrived on the island and no one else was allowed to leave. So in 1944, right before the end of the war, in fact, the 2,000 Jews still on Rhodes were deported to Auschwitz, where most of them were murdered. My father's parents, my grandparents, were murdered. His teenage sisters both survived. And he was told that his fiancée Becky had been killed. She was told that he had been killed. Fast forward half a century, so 25 years ago, he was on holiday in Cape Town and he overheard his fiancée's name. The same person to whom he had been engaged half a century earlier. He thought she had been killed, she thought he had been killed, and he now discovered she was a grandmother in her 70s living in Belgium. He was now a grandfather in his 70s living in Johannesburg. So
we've been, over this story, we've been showing pictures of your family members here, Vic. What is it like growing up in a family with such trauma? It's a shared experience by many in that part of the world, but for you, what was that like, having that history, with a traumatic history of your family?
It very much informs, I can only speak for personal experience obviously, it very much informs the way you see the world. I also was a senior editor on a very anti-apartheid newspaper in Cape Town during the apartheid era. So that, both those personal connections, being personally connected to the Holocaust, makes one so intrinsically aware of where racial hatred can lead. Because as everything does, it begins with words. And when racial hatred happens, when racial violence happens, when a genocide happens, it begins at this end of the spectrum with words, with demonizing people, with isolating people out of society. And that is exactly what we saw during this whole process. So growing up with that background, one is very aware, I was very aware, that I had no grandparents, I never had any grandparents, that 151 Alhadeffs, members of my own family, perished at Auschwitz, including my grandparents. So it's a very painful awareness, and you grapple with how you can deal with it in a positive way and try and extrapolate the positive out of it, which is looking at the positives on those who actually reacted against the violence and the positive messages that you can, to understand where racial hatred can lead.
In light of this anniversary, we're hearing many of the global leaders speak about a rise in anti-Semitism today. How do you see it? How does it play out in your world?
Just a few days ago, there was a study in France which found that a quarter of millennials in France had never heard of the Holocaust. Similar study done in the United States, where over 60% of millennials had never heard of Auschwitz. And that in itself would be of concern, because it's so important to understand where racial hatred can lead. And what makes it increasingly of concern is that it's happening against, to your question, against a background of a spike in anti-Semitic attacks in Europe, in the United States, and indeed here in Australia itself. And if we look at just 3 countries come to mind. In Germany itself, which has owned the Holocaust, what it did, there's a new political party there called the Alternative for Deutschland, which has 92 seats in the federal parliament, which has been described as a neo-Nazi party. Greece has a party called Golden Dawn. Its logo is almost a swastika. Hungary has a neo-Nazi party called Jobbik. So that is the concern, is that not only are millennials increasingly not being aware or knowing that the Holocaust took place, but this is happening against a spike in anti-Semitic incidents around the world, and including, unfortunately, here in Australia as well.
So finally, Vic, 75 years on, how important is to honour this anniversary and to continue honouring what happened to those people at Auschwitz?
One has to honour them, one has to be aware. And the best way to respond to that question is a great quote from Elie Wiesel, who was a teenager in the camps for 4 years, who went on to win a Nobel Peace Prize for his humanitarian work. And he said very powerfully, one must always take sides. Silence never helps the tormentor, always the never helps the tormented, always the tormentor. Neutrality always helps the oppressor and never the victim.
So speak up.
Exactly right.
Okay. Vic Alhadeff, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kath.